Hi, in the following presentation I'm going to quickly go over what CSS or Cascading Style Sheets is, how you might use them, and really the basics of Cascading Style Sheets. So first, what is it and why does it matter? Well, Cascading Style Sheets or CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. CSS, one of the benefits of CSS is that it separates the presentation from structure and content. When HTML was developed, it really wasn't seen as doing both, but over time, people started using HTML for both the presentation structure and content. What CSS does is it separates that. And basically what CSS does is it tells the user's web browser how an element is to be presented to the user. And so CSS, a lot of websites, the majority of websites nowadays, if they're not built in Flash, if they're aesthetically pleasing, most likely they're being run by Cascading Style Sheets. So why use Cascading Style Sheets? Sometimes people feel real comfortable with HTML. They really don't want to kind of get into all the thorniness of CSS. Well, what CSS does is it allows you to control and maintain multiple documents. It creates faster loading documents. It also makes it easy where you can make a change to one place and it's going to change all of your pages. So in this image here, you can see that if I update the master CSS file, whatever changes I make are going to be illustrated throughout all the pages. And the other thing that CSS can do is it can also make web pages more accessible. So let's go over the basics of CSS. How does it work? So CSS, sometimes like HTML, looks like a foreign language to people, but it's really broken down in some different components. The first thing you have is a rule, and it basically consists of one selector and at least one declaration. And so a selector is something like an H1 tag. And then a declaration includes a property and a value. And so font size is a property, 130% is a value. 12 point or 16 pixels. There are a lot of different values you can imagine, and there are a lot of different properties. So we're going to go over different types of selectors, but really knowing what properties and values are available, I found over the years that sometimes a good textbook or a good job aid helps me kind of refer to things and answer questions like that. So there are a lot of different types of selectors. So basically, if we go back here, this H1 tag, we're familiar with. It's a level 1 heading, but there are a lot of different selectors we could use besides just the H1 tag or even single HTML elements. Though that's probably the first and often way you'll begin is using CSS to redefine single HTML elements or tags, such as an H1 tag or a body tag or a link tag. You can also use groups of elements, so you can have an H1 tag, H2 tag, etc. You can also have an identifier, a class, and then a pseudo class. We're going to kind of get into these real briefly, each one of these. So a single style tag, that's where if you want to, let's say just for your level 1 heading, you want to decide what font you want it to be, what font size, and what color. So in this example, you can see that I've redefined the H1 tag by saying I want it to be Verdanda, 36 pixels, and I want it to be this color blue. And so then if you look at the result down below, you can see that by applying the style, that the basic HTML is just an H1 tag, hi world, close H1 tag. But because it's having this, the H1 tag has been defined, styled by CSS, you can see that it shows up as Verdanda, as a 36 pixels, and as the color blue. So you can think of a lot of different tags while you're developing websites that you want to throughout your entire website, every web page, you want to consistently style, let's say, your headers, heading tags, your body tag, maybe links, tables, etc. You can think of pretty much every element that you might have within a web page or website that you might want to use CSS to apply styles to. So a group of tags is basically something like this. So you might decide that you want all of your headings, no matter what, to be a Verdanda font. And so this would be in a way where you can put those down as your indicators. You can also use an identifier. And so this is perhaps another way that people use CSS a lot of times to structure their website. But in this case, I've set it up where I have a div tag. You can look down here under the HTML, and I've called this div, I've given it an identifier, an ID of left nav, for short for left navigation. And so then what happens is when I add that as my indicator for left nav, I can then add a declaration, and I can say within this left navigation, I want to make sure that the font is Verdanda, the background color is blue, and the font is white. And you can see there's actually the CSS should be on different lines here where it says background color, and then the width is 100 pixels. So basically an identifier is a way to give an ID to a specific element and then decide how you want to style that. So when you think of identifiers or IDs, the most common way people use CSS, and one of the things that started getting people really interested in CSS, was the ability to have it structure your website. So for a long time people were using basic tables to apply structure, but using a table model ended up causing a lot of problems, from consistency, the ability to have to update your sites at one time, one place. And so they call this thing the box model, and it's a common method of using an identifier and a div to structure the layout of your web page. And so in this example of this div, you can see in the middle where you can put your content, and then you have the ability to use CSS to adjust the padding from top, bottom, left, right, as well as the border, as well as the margin. And so it gives you a lot of flexibility beyond what you could think of basic tables, to control how much white space, the color of your borders, all these types of things. One problem with the box model, though, is Internet Explorer interprets it differently. And so you can see that while traditional CSS will basically decide the width from the content in the middle, Internet Explorer also takes into consideration the width of the border. So if it's a couple pixels, whatever it might be. So this is one thing that you definitely want to always think about. Now, to try to make sense of the box model a little more, we're going to pull up a site right here. And so this gives a basic demo of the box model. Once again, you can see the margin, you can see a background color, and you can see background image even that you can apply to it, padding, and a border. But if you move this, you can start seeing what CSS does is it's essentially layering these items. And so you can apply a background color, an image to this div, you can put a border around it, you can adjust not only the width of the border, but how much padding you want around there, as well as how much of a margin you want. And so this is something very powerful that the box model allows you to do to start structuring your website. Okay. So let's see the box model in action. So this is an example of the box model used to structure your website. So you can imagine how you could use a table to do this. But by creating a div and calling it and using an identifier and calling it container, you then can put stuff within that container, and it's going to control this layout. So in this case, I have a div that I've called container, and then I created a div within it called header, another div called left navigation, another one called body, and then footer. And so then I can use this, much like you would think you'd use tables, to structure the layout of my website. And so while using divs and IDs are one way to apply styles to the elements of your web pages, you can also use classes. And so a class is where an example might come up is when you want your left navigation hyperlinks to be styled differently than hyperlinks in your footer, as well as differently than hyperlinks that show up in the body of your web page. And so what you can do is you can create a class. So in this case, I've called this class left nav links, and I've decided I want it Tahoma font, 22 pixels, and then black. And so then down here you can see all I have to do is within the link tag down here I have class equals left nav links. But what you can see is that you can add classes within different divs, so you can use both of them, and often you will. And then last but not least, you have pseudo class selectors, and probably the most popular one is the ones you can use to redefine links throughout your whole website. And so you can decide that your basic link is going to be Verdanda 16 pixels in this case, but then I can decide when it's a link, do I want any text decoration? What I want, for instance, an underline. So in this case, I don't want my link underlined. When it's visited, I want it to change color. And then down here under the hover, you can see that I want, when someone mouses over my hyperlinks, I want it to be underlined as well as have a color. And then you can also apply the active if you want. And so that's just something to be familiar with, that you also have this ability to have pseudo class selectors. So what sometimes gets confusing is when do you use an ID or an identifier and when do you use a class? And so an identifier is specified only once on a page. And so basically when I want to set out the structure of my web page and I want to create divs as little containers to put stuff in, I use identifiers or IDs to do that. A class is used when you need to reuse something multiple times on a page. So an example might be you might have classes for images, how you want images to be formatted throughout your web page, as well as links. There are a lot of different ways you might use classes instead of identifiers, because it comes to a point where to have an identifier you have to have a div, and it can get out of control creating divs for everything that you want to style. And then basically use identifiers for main sections and then subsections of your page. One last thing, and this is something you've definitely seen the last few years more of, is people using shorthand for their CSS. And so what they basically do is they take, an example would be this first style up here with the font families, a 12-point Verdanda 12 pixels. Rather than having these 3 lines of CSS, you can collapse it down into font is bold 12 pixel Verdanda sans serif. Same example down here, and this is probably where I find myself using it the most, is when I want to add padding to a div. I tend to list it out like this. So this essentially has 5 pixels as the top. So you go top, right, bottom, left. So that's a common thing that you might use. So now let's talk about types of style sheets. So we've talked about why you want to use CSS. It's more than anything helps you manage all of your pages, the style and the format of it a lot easier. It also makes your pages load faster. Those are two of the main reasons that I like to use CSS. Then we talked about how the basic breakdown of a CSS and how you can redefine things such as any single given HTML tag. You can also use it with divs to structure and style components or elements of your pages as well as classes. But then, where does your CSS exist? Where do you put the code, if you will? And so there's different types of style sheets that you can use. So the main ones are browser defined, user defined, inline, embedded, external, and imported. Now, because we're really just talking about beginner stuff here, we're just trying to introduce you to the main concepts. I'm not going to really get into browser defined, because browsers basically have their own style sheet that they by default show things, and then users can change how they want things to look. But really the main ones you use when you first start doing this are inline, embedded, and external. And really I would say embedded and external are really the ones that I find using the most. But then finally imported are if you want to import an external style sheet from that you've used. You might have multiple style sheets. Sometimes you'll find if you're doing big websites, you might use imported as well. So inline. Inline is a way that you can directly within an element apply a style. So maybe you don't want to set up a div for this. Maybe you also don't want to set up a class because you don't see yourself doing this a lot. And you just want, for instance, let's say some text on a page to say under construction or coming soon, and you want it to be red. Well, you can actually apply that CSS right within that HTML tag. And so that's what inline means. And so, but for the most part, what people find themselves doing is they either use embedded or they use external. So With embedded, it's basically you're putting all of the CSS within the head of the HTML page. The problem with this is a couple reasons. One, if you want to update your CSS, you then have to update it in every page, in the header of every page. And so the CSS doesn't exist in one place, it exists in every one of your web pages. So this kind of takes away a lot of the benefits mentioned earlier about speeding up your pages, making it easy to update it all in one place. External CSS, on the other hand, an external CSS style sheet, basically is stored in one place, and then you can update that, and then once you make changes to that one style sheet, it then cascades down and affects all of your pages. And so I'm always a big fan of external style sheets. If I was going to do a one-page website, if you will, or maybe it's just 2 pages, I could see using embedded. Maybe it's simpler. But when it comes to if you're having multiple pages, it really makes sense to be focusing on using an external style sheet. So let's get a good idea about what do we mean by embedded versus an external. So in an embedded one, you actually put, and here's a screenshot taken from Dreamweaver, but you actually put the CSS within the head of your HTML page. So you can see that at line 3 the head starts, line 14 it closes, and then within that you have this basically code that says the following text is going to be CSS, and then you have your CSS. So in this case you can see the H1 tag is being defined as size 30 pixels and then that red color font, and then the style tag closes. And I basically just said that. So, so you can basically see how down here that in the HTML that it actually doesn't say anything. It just says the H1 tag. So where we tell basically your browser how to format those H1 tags is right here in the header of, basically in the head tag of the HTML page. So an external sheet, on the other hand, what you do is within your head. So once again, you find yourself in the head tag, you add the following code that says, basically uses a link to say not only what the CSS file that you're going to use, so now this says what CSS file I'm going to use, but also tells it where it's located. So in this case, master CSS is within the same directory, but it could be that this is on even a different website. So you could have, www.csn.com/css.master.css or whatever, and so it really can be located wherever. But once again, you can see that the browser looks at this and applies whatever styles it sees down here in this bottom style sheet, it applies to this web page. So then every web page that you create, you have to add this link to tell it what style to use, but then you only have one place to update your style. So basically here it's just telling you that the style sheet's telling it to be Verdanda, 36 pixels, and to be blue. Okay, so let's talk about the cascading part in cascading style sheets. So cascading, what that means is it determines the order of rules that are applied. So when you think about multiple style sheets linked to the same document, but a lot of times what you'll find is sometimes people will start with an external sheet, and especially if they're using new versions of Dreamweaver, they'll forget that, and they'll actually apply some of the styles within embedded in the head and others external. And so this basically cascading tells you the order in which style is going to be focused on. And so basically the user style overrides all other styles. So if your user has decided they want their font to be extra big, doesn't matter what size that you've determined that your font to be on your web page, the user can override that. And then inline styles will override embedded, linked and imported, and then embedded overrides linked and imported. And so while I like to use linked external style sheets, if you ever have embedded styles within the head, it's going to override that. So it's important to be careful when you're using multiple style sheets, because you don't want to, in one style sheet, say that you want the font to be 20 pixels and then another to be 30 pixels, and you're not sure why it's not acting the way you think it should. So basically, with multiple linked style sheets, the one at the bottom page takes precedence if there are other conflicts. And I notice I have a typo. Alright, so examples of CSS, let's take a look at CSS in Garden, because I think this is a good place to kind of get an idea of the way CSS works and how it separates the presentation, the structure, from the content. So this is a default page, but lots of people have then uploaded CSS to adjust this. So if I click here, I can see the same web page, but using CSS it looks totally different. And so I can keep going through here, and I can see all different examples here. And they're all doing the same thing. They're all just redefining this page. And so that's really the power of CSS. And if you've ever been to, it's simple examples are you go to a website and it allows you the ability to make the font bigger. Well, this is, CSS allows you to use your content and redesign everything by just redesigning the CSS. And so in these examples at the CSS in Garden, you can look at the HTML file. And so you can look that this is just the basic HTML without styles. And then you can look at the CSS file, and it's an external file that has been used to redefine these things. And so you can see that they're redefining the body tag, the paragraph tag, the heading tag. They have some of those pseudo classes that we talked about. And then they have some identifiers. Here's an identifier for the container. And if you go down, you can see if there are any classes. You look for the period. There's one, access key. So you can see that in this example, they're using all of the things we just talked about. Alright, so this is another example. Let's go back actually. In this example, let's pull this up. And there's so many great resources out there I can't possibly go through them all or show you. But what I like about this good example is you can actually play with it more. So if you want to see what setting the background color is like, over here you can edit it and you can see it change over here. And so in this case this is embedded style. And so basically what you can see is up here we have the heading tag. It closes, and then within that we have the CSS. So it's embedded within it, but it gives you the basic idea. So basically I can play with these, and you could play with seeing how changing colors is going to changing that text is going to basically change the color of that. And so that's basically how CSS works. And so you can play with different elements. So if you want to know how positioning a background image is gonna, and so in this case down here you can see that it's saying that for the body tag, it's gonna have this background image. It's not gonna repeat, and then it's gonna be positioned 200 pixels to the right. So if I change this to 100, you're gonna see that it changes. Okay, so now if I change it to 50, you notice how you see the text going over it, and so it's basically adjusting that. Or if I get rid of this, and so you can see that then it's, or here's a better example, let's get rid of the background image. Gotta make sure I don't get rid of the curly bracket. And there's the image is gone. So definitely recommend spending some time playing with this. Specifically in this course, we're going to have you spend time on some tutorials, so you're going to definitely get a lot more of this, as well as this presentation is going to follow up with a Dreamweaver tutorial